What's up, YouTubers and plant lovers? It's Justin, and today I was gonna show you an update video on my vanilla orchid. Real quick, I wanted to go ahead and thank my Patreon subscribers. If you're interested in supporting my channel through Patreon, please check a link in the description box below. If you do not have the monetary means to actually support my channel that way, please feel free to share my video with all of your plant-loving friends and family members as well. That always helps me out a bunch. Now, here is my stunning vanilla orchid, and I don't know that you can actually see all of it in its glory, but I measured him, and he is over 3.5 feet long. He's about 3.5 feet. It's definitely over 3 feet. It's pretty close to 3.5. But this is my vanilla planifolia, my vanilla orchid. Now, as you know, or may not know, I've noticed a lot of people didn't realize that vanilla comes from an orchid. And what happens is we actually cure the seed pods, which are the fruiting members of the orchid, and natural vanilla flavors come from those cured seed pods off of this orchid. So that's where we get that. And you can actually grow that in your home or outside, depending on where you live. Now, I live in Kentucky, northern Kentucky, and it is fall now, and it is actually getting a little cold, so I had to bring him inside. And I have him in an east-facing window, so he'll get ample morning light, and he's also under a little bit of LEDs as well. So he'll get morning light and then LEDs kind of through the rest of the day, and he loves that. So if you have a place that you want to put your vanilla orchid or just any other kind of orchid, and you don't think that that place gets a lot of light, consider using LEDs, because my orchids love them, and there have been some major advancements with smaller LED full spectrum grow lights, and they're not very expensive to actually run anymore, and they're not very expensive to actually purchase. So I do include a link on the ones that I use, so check that out in my description box if you are interested in going the route of artificial sunlight, and that really does help the orchids get a full spectrum of what they would kind of normally get out in nature. Now, the vanilla orchid is native to around Mexico, kind of tropical Mexico, so they are used to a decent amount of sunlight. I don't want to say a bunch of direct sunlight, because typically in the forest, in rainforest where they're found, it's really hot and really humid, and they grow up trees. As you can see, I've got a little trellis on him. When I bought him, he had about 7 leaves on him, and now he's double or tripled that. So clearly, I'm going to put him in a larger pot, and I made my own trellis here. I was kind of balling on a budget, so I didn't have a whole lot of money to go ahead and spend on him, and I couldn't find a trellis I liked anyways, so I wanted to go ahead and make one, and I got the wood that I used from Lowe's. I believe it was a 2 by 2 by 8 feet. It was 2 inch by 2 inch by 8 feet, somewhere around there. And you can kind of tell with the woods that they have there. The guy that was helping me said that the light blue ones, the tags on those meant that they weren't didn't have any kind of chemical additives to it. It was just kind of natural wood that had been heat treated. So that's what you really want if you're going to make a trellis for a plant. You don't want something that has a bunch of chemicals in it, because that will leach out into your soil and into your plant and kill your plant. So anything that's got HT on it and then has a natural wood-like grain and color to it, you're pretty safe to go ahead and use that. But like I said, they'll have a stamp on there with some numbers, and you'll see HT, meaning that it had been heat treated. And then if it looks like a natural wood, the other kinds that have been chemically treated will have kind of a greenish, kind of wet and dark kind of color to it. But this, you can tell it's been dried out, and it looks like natural wood. So I know that there hasn't really been any kind of chemicals on there. And under federal law, they are required to let you know if something does have chemicals in it that may end up hurting you or anyone else, or your plants or anything like that. So it was a safe bet to go ahead and use this. Now, all I had to do was the nice people at Lowe's went ahead and cut that up for me. They just cut it in half so I could fit it in my car. And then I had a handsaw at home, and I sawed it down to about what I needed. And this, I believe, was 2.5 feet. This was a little bit shorter. And then I went ahead and used the handsaw to kind of go ahead and saw some grooves in there. Because if you notice on these orchids, wherever the leaves come out, there are kind of smaller roots, aerial roots, that will go ahead and connect the orchid to the tree in nature. So with bark, the way it's placed, it is pretty narrow, so oftentimes it can wedge its little roots in there to actually help it hold on to it. And since this guy didn't have too much room to actually grow up on, the way I had him set it up, he was actually growing up my wall, so I had to actually be careful and remove him without actually hurting his aerial roots. But I think with this new trellis, he'll have a little bit of space to actually go ahead and wedge his roots in there to help him better secure himself naturally. And then I also have some gardening twine to kind of help him out until he gets his roots established and locked up in there himself. So as you can see, I have him in a little 4-inch pot, and he's got some wood compost, kind of bark chips, and sphagnum moss in there. They are terrestrial, and they're epiphytic also, so they can grow in a tree, or they can grow in the ground and kind of grow up a tree. So with mine, I have him in some orchid bark and some orchid moss or sphagnum moss to kind of help him retain his water, because they're fairly moderate drinkers. I said with light, they like kind of bright indirect light because the leaves can burn. I believe the variegated vanilla plants can tolerate a little bit more light, but I may be wrong on that. Let me know in the comments. I'm sure a vast majority of you will. But this guy doesn't take too much direct sunlight for extended periods of time. I mean, he can take some, especially if they're more established. So you kind of have to find that sweet spot with them, because too much of a good thing can burn him out, and not enough, he won't flower, and if he doesn't flower, he's not going to produce his vanilla pods. So if you've noticed that you've had your orchid for a long time, most orchids won't flower until they reach a mature height, somewhere around 10 feet. And then if the light's not right, they won't flower either. So if yours is about 10 feet long and he's doing pretty well, but you notice he hasn't flowered, I would consider increasing the light with him. So you may have to check out artificial sunlight and use the LEDs, as I was saying. But if he's not flowering, either he's not mature and not ready, or he's not getting the right amount of light. So that could be a problem there as well. Now, in nature, they do get anywhere from around 50 to 75 feet long. They can really kind of stretch out and get really kind of bushy. And when they flower, they are rather large and showy, but they are kind of short-lived. But they are produced in succession, meaning that they can be enjoyed for an extended period of time, anywhere from a couple of weeks to a month or so. So whenever you start to notice them, they are short-lived, but they do smell really good oftentimes. And like I said, they'll continue to flower for several weeks, up to a month or so. So now that I've talked a little bit about this plant, I do want to go ahead and transplant it. He has put on a lot of mass, so I want to get him out of this tiny little pot relatively quickly. And I have a little bucket underneath me to catch any falling debris, and I will go ahead and cut him out. Now, as always, I have sanitized my pruning shears and my root rake with some isopropyl alcohol to help keep areas clean and without infecting my plant. So the first thing I want to do is cut these zip ties out that are holding in the makeshift trellis. And then I will go ahead and cut out the gardening twine that I used to secure him to his trellis. I will start kind of squeezing the pot to help loosen the root ball. And just take your time, be careful, you are going to make a little bit of a mess. And take your time because the roots are attached to the trellis, so you don't want to just rip them off because you can do damage to the root mass as well. Now I've separated the plant from the trellis, and I will go ahead and start adding in some of this Miracle-Gro orchid potting mix down here. And I'm not gonna lie, to actually help secure this plastic pot, I used the zip ties, and I did put a little bit of rocks down the bottom to help hold its center of gravity down a little bit so that it wouldn't just topple over. But yeah, you can go to Lowe's or Home Depot or Walmart or even the dollar store and get some of those, I think they call them beach pebbles. And then I would clean those out as well, because you don't know who's had what during shipping for how long. Just as always, I'm a big advocate about cleaning your pots out too whenever you get them, which I always do with warm soap and water, hot soap and water, and a scrub brush. And then I will mix in a little bit of this premium orchid moss just to kind of help with the roots and keeping moisture in check. Because as you know, wood chips do lose moisture relatively quickly. So if you add a little bit of organic material in here like this, it will help it hold on to water for a little bit longer. And as I said earlier, they are kind of moderate drinkers, maybe a little bit more than most plants. So you want to kind of help them out that way. And all I'm doing is just kind of separating some of this root mass out and this soil and bark chips out just with my fingers into the bucket below, and just kind of holding it with my left hand and letting my right hand kind of do all the work. Gently, take your time, don't pull, and if you have to, don't pull too hard and too fast. And remember that these roots will be attached to some of these bark chips and some of this moss in here as well. So just take your time. Now, I was kind of planning on removing a bunch of this root mass. And since I did just cut on these pruning shears, I'm going to sanitize them again. Now, you don't want to just dump all this down in here. You want to kind of take your fingers and wiggle them down in there gently, so that you know that the bark chips aren't just sitting on top of all this root mass, but are actually going down in there to kind of help the plant secure itself. And then, as I said, because of the trellis that I chose and wanted to use, I chose a plastic pot, an 8-inch plastic pot, because I knew that a good majority of this trellis was going to go ahead and take up a lot of the root space. So that's why I wanted to trim it back fairly well, so that I won't have to repot it again until sometime next summer. And as I said, every so often, just kind of stick your fingers down in there and wiggle them around a little bit to make sure that you are getting the bark chips and moss down in there fairly evenly. Don't just apply a bunch of bark chips without some sphagnum moss, because you do want to help with the water retention in here as well. And be aware, don't overdo it with the moss, because you will end up holding on to too much moisture. Now, it may look like I'm putting in a decent amount of orchid moss. I'm really not. I would say about every 4 or 5, maybe 6 handfuls of bark moss, I put in about, I'm just pulling a little bit out at a time and kind of just spacing it around there fairly evenly. Like I said, you don't want too much moss, because the bark chips will hold on to some moisture, but the moss is in there to help hold on to a little bit more. So if you put way too much in there, you're going to have a problem with root rot and fungus and all kinds of other stuff. So used fairly sparingly. Now, these orchids do like their humidity too, so make sure you are spraying them and possibly even using a pebble tray. I have a humidifier fairly close to mine, and he's in love with it. So, like I said, in nature, they are kept fairly pretty warm, especially during the summer, and then it's pretty humid as well. As far as soil pH, they like it fairly neutral. I think around 6.6 to about 7 is ideal. So you don't want to kill them with too much acidity because that will mess them up also. Alright, it looks like the only thing left I have to do is go ahead and secure him to his trellis and water him. Alright, now that I've secured my orchid up to the trellis, I just want to go ahead and say don't over tie it. You can end up hurting your orchid, not to mention not leaving ample space for it to kind of grow out. So when you do secure it, do it a little tight, but make sure there's ample room for them to grow. And if you know that it is fairly tight, check back in a couple of weeks because they can grow. I don't want to say quick, but they can put on some mass, a little bit of mass fairly quickly, but they aren't very fast growers. So I've had him for about a year now, and he, like I said, he had about 7, maybe 8 leaves, and since then he's pretty much doubled where he was. Just make sure you leave space wherever you do tie him against his trellis, because he will grow, I don't want to say quickly again, but they will put on some mass before you actually do realize it. So with all that in mind, I want to say good luck with these guys. They can be a little fussy growers. I've had no problems out of him. Like I said, he likes bright and direct sunlight, a decent amount of water, a little bit more humidity. There's probably several different things in the fungal department you need to look out for. But as long as you kind of keep a lookout and stay vigilant, you should be fine with your orchid. Like I said, I've had him for some time now, and he's doing fairly well, I feel like. So they aren't too hard to actually care for. While you're at it, please leave me a comment. Let me know if you've ever had any kind of success or failures with a vanilla orchid. And like I said, I do have the variegated vanilla orchid. I'll try to do an update video on that one before too long, but I do have a couple other videos that I want to get out first. So while you're at it, also hit the subscribe button if you already haven't done that, or the like button. Those always help me out tremendously. Until next time, guys, always stay safe and plant prudently. Thank you, YouTube.